So our first speaker is also, as I mentioned, one of our co-instructors. So I'm very happy to be working together with Donna Harris. Donna is one of the co-founders of 1776. Earlier in her life, she was an evening MBA student, as are many of you, at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She spent time at Oracle and was a part of 4 startups before 1776, so we count that as a 5th. Some of those had successful exits, but some of them did not, so she can tell you what it's like to not succeed with an entrepreneurial venture. When I first met Donna, it was about 4 years ago. She was helping to run a major program called the Startup America Partnership, which was a White House instigated private sector initiative to help expand entrepreneurship across the country. And as part of that, she got to know and got to work with a guy named Evan Burfield, who is the co-founder. The two of them together kind of cooked up this idea for 1776, which is all about taking the strengths of the Washington, D.C. market and turning it into an entrepreneurial powerhouse. So she can tell you more about what 1776 is doing, the lessons that she's learned along the way as an entrepreneur, as well as how these startups and these companies and these entrepreneurs are really making a difference in the world. So I'm proud to introduce our first speaker, Donna Harris.
Thanks, Jeff. Awesome. Well, I'm having flashbacks. First of all, no one's sitting in the front row. It's good that that never changes in an MBA or an undergraduate program. Second of all, I love the name tags. I used to hate to have to buy a name tag up because I would hope that no one would call on me, because for many of you who are part-time people, you know you're coming from a busy day at work and you may or may not be as well prepared, and you're thinking, please, dear God, don't let them call on me. So it's nice to be here. I'm going to start with a question, since Jeff has been trying to tease out some answers from the class. So let me, by a show of hands, startup. Couple, meta startup. Couple hands. I would say every one of your hands should be up. If you think about our world, every one of you has met a startup. There's a little startup that started in 1908 with $28,000 in cash called Ford Motor Company. Right? Every company in our world that we work with and deal with and is on the Fortune 500 at some point was a startup. Right? You think about a startup that started with 1 root beer stand with 9 seats just north of Washington, D.C. Anybody know what startup that is?
Marriott.
Right, Marriott. Right? Startup in Arkansas, 1 store. Everyone knows this one, right? Number 1 on the Fortune 500 list. This is what startups are all about, right? So when we think about startups, first of all, I want to start by debunking the myth that they are young white guys with long hair drinking Red Bull, sitting behind a computer and coding at 4 a.m. in the morning. Right? Startups are simply the younger cousins to the most established companies that we interact with every day, all day long in our lives. Amazon, Starbucks, every grocery store you go to, Whole Foods, all of them have startup stories, right? So when you think about startups, I want you to think through that lens. Don't think about it through the tech, Facebook kind of lens. So one of the things I want to talk about is that when you think about startups, it's pretty hard to have a conversation without what 2 words being uttered? Silicon Valley, right? If you listen to the press, you read the paper, anytime you hear the word startup, I challenge you throughout the semester to listen to see how many times the word Silicon Valley is mentioned when people talk about startups. And there's a reason, right? Historically, at its peak, Silicon Valley represented 1/3 of the world's venture capital. 1/3 of the world's deals got done in that one region of that one state. Now, I said at its peak, right? You wouldn't know that from the media, but actually today Silicon Valley represents 27% of the world's venture capital. Now that's still a big number, right? 27% of the world's venture capital. Washington, D.C. would love to have 27% of the venture capital deals done in its city. But what that means is that something has changed in the landscape, and we're just beginning to see that now. So I want to talk about what has changed, why has it changed, and what does that mean, right? Because the course title is Startups That Matter, right? So first you have to understand why something has changed. So let's talk about the post-2000 era, right? Everybody knows about sort of the crash of the dot-com era, bubble bursting, stock markets losing trillions of dollars in value. That in and of itself was a very bad event. But it triggered 3 really interesting things to happen that has really forever changed the innovation landscape in our world. So it's really important that you understand, and I'll give you a little bit about it tonight, but I would encourage you to do some reading on your own about these things, right? So first, we have this little thing called cloud computing. Now, I have a little bit of a technical background. I know enough about cloud computing to be dangerous. But what I do know is that if you think about cloud computing through the lens of an entrepreneur, when I first started my very first startup, a long, long time ago, I had to go and raise a Series A round, which is your first round of serious capital, of over $5 million in order to take my version 1 product to market. Right? And if you look at what was embedded in that cost, it was a lot of technology. It was hardware, servers, hosting, rack space, all the tech that it was required to actually take that product and put it in the hands of my users. Today, if I wanted to start that same company, I would not have to raise not even $1 million in capital. I would be able to do it on tens of thousands of dollars in capital. Right? So this one change in terms of the technology and the cost that it takes to actually launch these kinds of businesses has really been a sea change in innovation. Now, why does that matter? Right? If you think about the reasons people went to Silicon Valley, it was all about the money. Right? If you think about a third of the venture capital sitting in the valley, you need venture capital, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the valley. Right? What this allows now is any entrepreneur with any idea can use local seed money to take that idea and turn it into a first iteration of a product. And so that opens up a lot of possibilities for where you can start your company and how far you can go and grow your company without a serious round of capital. So that's the first thing, cloud computing. The second thing is the rise of the social collaboration platform. Right? After 2000, we had platforms like Twitter and Facebook get launched in the early 2000s. And while these are fun tools, and some of us love them and want to tweet during class, and others maybe not because we want to keep our personal and private tweets separate, the power of these tools is that they have allowed the producer of content to directly reach the consumer of the content. So if you think about somebody who has thoughts and wants to write them in a blog post, like for this class, no longer do you need a middleman. You don't need to write for a news agency. You just publish that content and have it directly reach your consumers. All right, so it opens up possibilities for new business models and eliminating the middleman in a market. So we'll file that away as the second thing. The third thing is these smart little gizmos called smartphones. Probably everyone in this room has one. Right? And shortly after the smartphone was invented, the App Store was invented. And between those two things, 1.7 billion people in the world carry the entire internet around in their pocket, or their purses, if they're ladies. And millions of apps downloadable at a single touch of a button. So this means if you're an entrepreneur and you've produced an app or you've produced a product, you can get that product to your users using this distribution platform. Right? So the combination of cloud computing, collaboration platforms, smartphones, and App Store creates an entire different landscape to think about who starts companies, how they start companies, where they start companies, how much capital it takes to start companies, the kinds of companies they create, the business models that those companies have in order to succeed. All right? So it's a very, very exciting, scary time in the world of innovation. Now, why do I say scary? Right? If you are an old school retailer, an old school news agency, you are a bookstore on the corner, this means competition is coming from any corner of the world. Think about 10 years ago, if you were a taxi driver. Somebody said to you that your ability to make a living driving a cab was going to go away, you thought they were crazy. Because you had this thing called a medallion that guaranteed your ability to make money as a cab driver. Never in your wildest imagination would you assume that a startup called Uber would completely disrupt the taxi industry for good. So many organizations are looking at that Uber example and saying, wow, if it can happen to the transportation industry, if it can happen to taxi drivers, it can happen to me. It can happen to any industry. It can happen to my industry, right? So if you're an entrepreneur, it's a very exciting time. If you're an institution, maybe a bit scary. So let's talk about some of this crazy activity that's been going on. How many Instagram users do we have? Come on, you can admit it. You like Instagram, you like Pinterest. All right, so Instagram, founded 2010, acquired by Facebook for $1 billion just 2 years later, 13 employees. 13 employees. What kind of a business model is that? And what do you do with that, right? If you're Marriott and you're competing with Airbnb, and Airbnb has a similar business model where you have fewer employees for the same amount of revenue, how do you compete when you have bricks and mortar hotels? Right? These are really exciting and scary times. Pinterest, one of my personal favorite websites, founded in 2010. Since then, anybody posit a guess how much money they've raised? $750 million. Their valuation, $5 billion with a B, for basically a giant pinboard, right? So all of this exciting activity, whether it's bark boxes and dollar shaving clubs, there's all kinds of innovation going on, primarily around our lives as consumers. But if you're like me, and you probably are because you signed up for this class, you're probably scratching your head when you hear this stuff and you ask yourself, there must be more to the digital revolution than Instagram and Snapchat. And it turns out that you wouldn't be alone. So lucky for us, the World Economic Forum did a nice survey, which they released this past weekend. And they reached out to thousands of millennials in 125 countries. And what they found was the top issue that millennials were concerned about in our world was social and economic inequality. Millennials think differently about what it means to do well and do good, right? And if you think about the world, these are some pretty big, challenging times. Almost half the world, 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. 3.5 million people just in the US alone experience homelessness every single year. 250 million of the 650 million school-age kids in our world can't read, write, and do basic math. 780 million people lacking access to clean water. 3.4 million people die every year from waterborne disease. These are big problems, right? And so if you think about startups and you think about the power of the digital economy and entrepreneurship and innovation and creation, startups have an incredibly powerful role to play in our world and in these social problems. So I want to talk to you about a few examples. So in the past 2.5 years, I and the other members of the 1776 team, some of whom are here in the back row, raise your hand and wave, ladies, we have had a chance to travel the world multiple times over. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. But in doing so, we have found in every single country, in every single city we have visited, hundreds of entrepreneurs who have the same viewpoint, who believe in the power of the internet to change the world for the better. All right, so if you think about them, there are people like Rose, who is the CEO and founder of a company called HandUp. She lives in Silicon Valley, and she, like most people in Silicon Valley, was on her smartphone, pecking away, and almost tripped over a homeless person. And thought to herself, wow, everything I can do on this device, and there isn't a single thing I can do to help this person in front of me. There's something wrong with that. And so she turned it into a company called HandUp. And she is literally allowing you, the crowd, to help fund the tangible needs of homeless people, like dentures, a bicycle, a down payment on an apartment, a suit to wear to a job interview, a computer to use at their community college class. And by the way, she's doing it with funding from some of the top people in Silicon Valley. It's people like SheFighter in Amman, who I had a chance to travel there and meet. She's an entrepreneur whose friend was being abused by someone in her family. And she thought to herself, somebody should do something about this. And that somebody was her. So she started a self-defense network for women in the Middle East. And that has become a franchise model that is now growing throughout all the underdeveloped nations. It's groups like Silverside Detectors in Boston invented a technology that goes into any window and turns that window into a nuclear detection device. Local Roots Farms, who realized that there were food deserts in inner cities because there was no way to grow produce within an urban environment on scale. And so they have a technology that actually allows you to create a farm in a shipping container. And you put the shipping containers right downtown, right in the middle of those food deserts, so people have access to homegrown fresh produce. Right? I could go on and on and on and on and on. These entrepreneurs are everywhere, and they are not building tiny little companies. They are emboldened by the examples of the Ubers of the world saying, I can completely upend a market if I just look at the market through a completely different lens. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this class, is how do entrepreneurs think differently and act differently and focus on this type of innovation? Who are these people and why are they tackling these hard problems? And what does it take to be successful in doing that? So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing and why 1776 felt that doing this course together with Georgetown was really an important exercise. So Evan and I both are serial entrepreneurs. I've run a couple ed tech companies, a health IT company, and I've always felt a little bit like a square peg in a round hole, in that all the talk about entrepreneurship is about Silicon Valley, and yet I always felt that what mattered most when I got to the end of my life wasn't how much money I made, it was the impact that I had on my life. But I didn't want to go start a not-for-profit, right? I have always had the lens that I can create something interesting and something meaningful, but do it through the lens of a startup. Because it turns out that if the startup is successful at scaling, as a byproduct of that success, they will have helped achieve the social mission, right? If Rose is successful at Hand Up, she will have helped a lot of homeless people. So at 1776, we're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and our mission is very much to find, fund, and grow the companies that are really tackling big challenges and are using high-growth startups to do that, right? So how do we find them? We travel all over the world through our Challenge Cup competition. It's a $1 million prize. We are literally running it in 54 cities this year, including San Francisco and New York, but also including Islamabad and Tehran. Through that competition, who knows what we'll find? Some really fascinating, amazing companies. The winners will come to Washington, D.C. in May, and many of them will get funding. A good number of them will get a lot of media attention and potentially funding and customers and access to channels. We've built a network of global incubators around the world called the Startup Federation. And that's a fancy way of saying, if you're a startup in a place like Islamabad and you're doing amazing things, you should not be constrained by who is in Islamabad to help you. You should have access to the best mentors, the best customers, the best thinking and curriculum and ideas to help you grow. And it turns out with technology, we can make that happen today. So this network of incubators works in a hyper-local, hyper-global way. So you have a first line of defense locally, but you're plugged into a broader global network. So through those programs and a number of others, we want to leave no stone unturned around the world to find the most promising companies. Funding. So we ourselves run 2 funds at the seed stage. We make venture capital investments in companies ourselves. But we also work to make sure that we curate a network of investors so that the companies that are beginning to see that breakout level of success can shortcut the cycle to meet the investors that will care about their ideas. And then finally, the growing. We're going to spend a lot of time in this class on the growing, because how you grow a startup in a government-controlled, mandated, regulated, impacted market is a lot different than how you grow a BarkBox. You're not going to take your app and pop it in the App Store, run a social media campaign, and have it go viral. If you're building a healthcare app, you're going to have to know how to deal with healthcare institutions. If you're disrupting the taxi industry, whether it's offensively or defensively, you're going to have to deal with local government. So we're going to talk about not just throwing up our hands and saying, oh, these markets are hard, but we're going to talk about the toolkit that you can use to actually drive change in these markets. So we run multiple campuses. We have a campus right by the White House. We have a campus that is opening this week near the Pentagon in Crystal City. We have a campus in San Francisco, and we'll ultimately have additional presence around the world. And through the combination of the programming and all the initiatives, we really want to shortcut the cycle time that it takes these entrepreneurs to figure out if there's a there in their business. And if there is, help them figure out how to drive scale. So with that, I'm going to close, but I want to open it up for your questions because I'm sure, I hope, this has stimulated some thinking and some questions maybe percolating from you guys.